Hello, YouTube, and welcome back to another book review from me, your host, Logan Albright. I'm returning to the weird and wonderful world of Anthony Burgess today with another book I picked up when I was in Scotland. It's a little bit hard to find Anthony Burgess's books here in the United States, him being a British writer and not very well appreciated over here. But I found in the bookstores in the UK, I'm able to find his books pretty easily. So I buy them when I'm over there. And I bought a couple when I was over there last time. And one of the ones I bought is 1985. I am a fan of 1984 by George Orwell. I enjoy that book, and I find it very prescient and has a lot of important things to say about society and government and things like that. So I wanted to read Anthony Burgess's take on it because he's become one of my favorite writers, and I've basically resolved to read everything I can find by him, every book that he's written, of which there's several dozen. So it's going to take me a while, but I'm going through them. This, I have to say right off the bat, is not one of my favorite Anthony Burgess books. It's a very peculiar little book because half of it, it's not very long, as you can see, and the first half of it is basically an extended essay discussing 1984 and what he thinks of it, whereas the second half of it is his own little sketch of a dystopian society, which I'll talk about in a minute. That's, it's not even really a full novel or even a novella. It's very short. It's sort of just a sketch of what a society might look like. It doesn't have too much of a plot. It's just sort of a world building sort of exercise. So it's an odd book that it's half essay and half fiction, but it is kind of concerned with the future and his response to 1984. The first half of the essay, I think I actually prefer to the fiction part because he has a lot of interesting things to say about Orwell and about 1984. First of all, he thinks that it's often misinterpreted and that people use the term Orwellian when it's not appropriate. And he says that 1984 is less of a prophecy of the future and it's more of a satire of the present, the kind of post-World War II reality with Stalinism and Nazism that Orwell had lived through. It was written in 1948, I believe, and I think Orwell actually wanted to call it 1948, but the publishers insisted that he call it 1984 instead because it was too close to home, I guess. And so he kind of talks about that relationship of it. And then he talks a lot about Orwell, the kind of contradiction within Orwell, because Orwell was a lifelong socialist. He fully believed in socialism as a form of government. He just didn't like Stalinism. He didn't like the Soviet Union. He thought that the idea of socialism had been perverted and ruined by these totalitarian communist types. And so that's sort of what Animal Farm is about, and that's sort of what 1984 is about. And Burgess kind of talks about how he thinks that's a little bit of a contradiction to be anti-totalitarian but pro-socialist because he thinks that things go together. And Burgess has more of a kind of conservative, slightly more libertarian leaning. I don't know if I'd call him a libertarian, but he's slightly more conservative leaning viewpoint on these things. So he talks a lot about that. And then one of the interesting things about Orwell is in 1984, there's a lot of backwards-looking kind of past nostalgia. He talks about, there's a lot of rural references to the way things used to be. There's sort of a feeling of this kind of, positive earlier state of being where the future has sterilized everything and taken the life out of everything. And Burgess says that's very atypical for a 20th century socialist. Most socialists are forward-looking and they're interested in the future and they want to tear down the institutions of the past and they want to get rid of tradition and they want to replace it with a kind of scientific planning of the future. And Orwell has this sort of, suppressed longing for the past that he lets shine through his fiction. So all that's very interesting, and I enjoyed that. Also, there's a section in the essay where he talks about his inspiration. Burgess talks about his inspiration for writing A Clockwork Orange, which is another piece of dystopian fiction written around this time. And he says that basically his motivation for Clockwork Orange is to emphasize the importance of moral choice, and that moral choice is what makes us human, and without the option to choose bad, we can't meaningfully choose good. And I think that's really important, and I love A Clockwork Orange for that. I think that message really shines through, and it's something really awesome. So I like that essay. Then the second half of the book is called 1985, and it is kind of Burgess's version or response or alternate timeline to 1984. And it's a lot more realistic than 1984 because it actually looks pretty close to what Britain looks like now. It's not that far off. Instead of having a all-powerful totalitarian big brother state running everything, it's a much more decentralized form of dystopia that Burgess imagines. He has writing in the late 70s. This book was written in 1978, right before Margaret Thatcher came into power. and he talks about kind of the trade unions running everything. He imagines a syndicalist society in which all the firms are ostensibly owned by the workers and operated by the workers, but it's really the trade unions who run everything, and they deny people the right to work if they don't want to. If they decide that they're striking that week, then no one's allowed to go in and work and earn money. And all the individual workers are sort of at the mercy of these trade unions. That's sort of, I guess, the Britain that, I don't know too much about Britain in the 70s, honestly, but I guess that's the Britain that he was experiencing at that time and he was worried about, and he's kind of taken it to its logical conclusion in this. There's a king who's sort of ineffectual and doesn't really have any power, and then the other half of it is like half of London or half of England has been taken over by an Islamic theocracy, which is again not that far from what we're seeing in Britain these days. So there's sort of this tension between these two factions. There's the Islamic theocracy, and there's the trade unionists, the syndicalists who are running everything, and there's crime in the streets and hoodlums everywhere, and the police seem pretty good at like tracking down individual harmless people who are just violating their bureaucratic rules. They're pretty good at enforcing that bureaucracy on people, but they're not very good at stopping the violent hoodlums from terrorizing everybody. And there's birth defects from the kind of corrupt medical or scientific establishment that's happening. All the children have birth defects and everything's terrible. And it's a very depressing and sort of imminently believable sort of vision of a future of England where, it's this multicultural society, which I don't actually have a problem with personally. I think multiculturalism is sort of cool, but, I think Burgess is reacting against what he was seeing in England. It's this multicultural society where the Islamic theocracy is running everything, and the syndicalists are running everything, and everybody's poor, and there's crime everywhere, and no one has any freedom. But it's a much more decentralized form of oppression versus just one, all-powerful Big Brother state that's looking after everybody. It's like coming from all directions at once, and that sort of makes it more depressing and harder to fight against. So it's a fairly bleak book. It's a fairly depressing book. It lacks a lot of Burgess's sort of characteristic humor that he puts into things, although it does have some of his fascination with language is in there, which I always appreciate. I love listening to him talk about language. But I found his analysis of 1984 and his discussion of his own work with A Clockwork Orange far more interesting than the little vignette of a dystopian London that he talks about. So 1985 I think I've read 6 or 7. I think I've read 7 Burgess novels now. This is not one of my favorites, but it was interesting, and it's a little curiosity that I think is very much of its time, although, there are echoes of what he talks about that are still being seen today in London and England. So I think that's worth knowing about for that. But as a piece of literature, I wouldn't rank it among his best. So I'm looking forward to moving on with his bibliography and reading some of his other novels, because I'm sure there's many gems to be found among those several dozen novels that I have not yet read. That's my review of Anthony Burgess, 1985, written in 1978. I don't have too much more to say about it, so I'll leave it there. If you enjoyed this review, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click that bell for notifications, and leave me a comment down below telling me what you think about all this business. I'd love to hear your opinion. And then check back every Wednesday for yet another book review. I try to finish a book every week and talk about it. It's a lot of reading, but what else have I got to do, right? Thanks so much for watching. I've been your host, Logan Albright, and I will catch you next time.